have for today. So today we're going to discuss a bar graph. Now this bar graph was a recent IELTS Writing Task 1 question and it was asked on 21 September 2023. So let's have a look at this bar graph before we start into it. The bar graph says that the chart shows the hours worked per week by people in 4 European countries in 2002. So as you can see, there are 4 countries. We have France, we have Sweden, UK, and we have Denmark. So how these 4 countries, what are the number of hours, average number of hours the workers are putting in each of these countries? That is what we are given here. And then how many percentage of people are putting that particular amount of hours. So if you can see, let's have a look at this particular. If we see France, there's an x-axis, and in this axis, we're given the number of hours, the hours per week. Here we are given the percentage of workers. That means 1 to 14 hours. How many percentage of workers worked for 1 to 14 hours? 10% of the workers. This is how the information is presented. Now, before even I start writing this, I have to make sure that I understand what information is given to me and in what way is it given to me. What is being represented on the x-axis, what is being represented on the y-axis, and how it is correlating with each other. All right. So as usual, there are a few things that we have to keep in mind. What are those things? Now you see there's a lot of data here given. There's a lot of complicated, like at very first glance, this might look complicated to a lot of students, but in actuality, it is not very complicated. But when we are writing a report, we need to make sure that we are not just simply quoting data. We are making sure that we are getting the inference and then quoting the inference instead of just writing down what has been given to us, because that is what the examiner wants to assess. Examiner does not want to see that how well you can copy paste data. The examiner wants to know how can you create an inference, analyze the data, and then write down. How do we make sure that the inference is coming across? We summarize the information. So when I say summarize, all of this information, we have to pick and choose the relevant factors, the main highlights, and then summarize into 150 words at least, at the minimum. But then you can go ahead and write around 180 words, which is the optimum word limit that we suggest our students to use, but do not exceed more than 200 words because then it becomes too wordy and too lengthy, which does not serve the purpose. So summarize the information, make comparisons, and also highlight information, important information, right? So let's see what is the data that is given to us. Now, before we start writing down this, let's have a look at the main features, the key features. So I always start by looking at the highest and the lowest values. So let's start with France. What is the highest value that you can spot here? So the highest value, it is pretty evident, is 31 to 35 hours of number of hours. That is the highest and it is rated at 50%. Any other inference that you can make out of here, any other property that is striking out to us? Then we can see the lowest is 10%, but there are several categories for 10%. We'll just keep a mark here. For Denmark, we can see the highest is 36 to 45, 40 again, and this is at 50%. Here it was 31 to 35, here it is 36 to 40. And then if we talk about the lowest number of hours, then there are 10% and there are several categories for it. Moving on to Sweden. In Sweden, we can see the highest percentage is again 36 to 40, but here it is 60% rather than 50%. And for UK, again, the category 36 to 40 stands out with 50% of workers deploying 36 to 40 hours per week. Now, this is the highest factors that we have seen. Anything else that is striking out to us in this particular data? Well, if you see any lowest, we can see that this is the lowest, something around, I'm guessing 5 to 7%, approximately we can put it like that. And here the lowest is 15 to 20 hours, that is something less than around 7%. So these are the features that I've marked, but this has no relevance. I'm just inferring from the data. Let's move on. All right. So before we start writing this task 1, let's have a general idea of how the structure of this task 1 is going to look like. So number 1, we'll have paraphrase. So what do I mean by paraphrase? Paraphrase means whatever the question is given to us, this question, you paraphrase this and you write this in the first paragraph. You can add the details. For example, if the year is given to us, but we are not given the years, we know that there's percentage of workers. Then if the groups are given to us, for example, we know the countries that are given to us here: France, Denmark, UK, Sweden. So you can mention them in your paraphrase if you want, because they are not mentioned here. In anything else in the data, in the chart that you can see is worth mentioning, you can all, of course, go ahead with it. For example, the information here is depicted in percentages. So we can say that the number of workers is depicted in percentage form. That can be included in your paraphrase. Then we move on to your overall body paragraph. Now, what do we mean by overall body paragraph? Now, this is where these pointers that we highlighted, the highest and the lowest, are important. Because when we say the highest value, we see that something, the striking out feature, we can quote them in overall paragraph. But remember, here no data is to be mentioned. That you will not mention it was 50%, it was 60%. We can only mention the categories that were highest, or if you find there's some sort of lowest or some sort of drop. So for a simple explanation of how overall works, I always show my students this graph. Now this graph, if you can look at this graph, you see there's a lowest point. Here's the lowest point. There's a period of stagnancy and there's a peak. These are the overall highlight main features. So whenever you're thinking about an overall, this is what we are going to talk about. If it is some related to time, then you can mention that it was highest in this year, then there was a period of stagnancy. But if it is something like this, we can see the highest values, but there's no particular lower value because there are several categories in the same value. So we can just focus on highest values here. And then we move on to body paragraph 1 and body paragraph 2. So let's go ahead and start with the paraphrase. So here you can see the given bar graph illustrates the working hours put in by workers in 4 European countries. See, this was not mentioned in the question itself. You can, of course, go ahead and add this: France, Denmark, Sweden, UK. In 2002, the data is measured in percentage. So this is what we talked about, that how the data is measured. The data is given to you in percentage. This was not again mentioned in the question, but you can see it in the table. So you can go ahead and mention this. Let's move on to the overall. Right. On the whole, it is evident that, so this is the overall paragraph. As I mentioned, overall will be highlighting the main features. So on the whole, you can start with this, or you can write overall as a starting linker for your overall paragraph. It is evident that the highest proportion of employees in Denmark, Sweden, and UK. So we saw Denmark, Sweden, and UK. So the highest number of workers were working 36 to 40 hours. That is why we will write worked 36 to 40 hours per week. Now see, I have not mentioned the percentage here. I have not mentioned that it was 50% in Denmark, 60% in Sweden, because that is the data that we'll be talking about in the further body paragraphs, but not here. Whereas to create a contrast, the image of contrast, France, it was only 31 to 35 hours per week. And here we are talking about the highest proportion. So this is how you write the overall. You make an inference of the highlights, and then you go ahead, start with overall on the whole or some sort of linker, and then create categories without mentioning the data. Let's move on to the first body paragraph. Now, when we are writing the body paragraphs, you can divide the data according to your wish. Now, you can choose to write about France and Denmark in first body paragraph, then Sweden and UK, or you can choose to write about France and UK together or club. So this clubbing is very subjective, however you wish to do it. But the best way is you can club to similar structures that show you some charts that show you the similar structure. For example, if you look at overall, if we look at Denmark and UK, we can see there's some sort of similarity here, right? So all of these are around 10 percentages. Similarly, these are also around 10 percentage. Then these are also around 10, and these are somewhat around between 10 to 20. So you can see how there's sort of a correlation between these data. So I chose to go ahead and write this in first body paragraph. So I start in Denmark and the UK, 50% of workers worked 36 to 40 hours. Now see, here I'm mentioning the percentage. Here I'm mentioning the exact data. and just 10% of workers worked around 1 to 30 hours per week. So see how I clubbed 1 to 30, all these categories. Instead of writing 1 to 14, 15 to 20, we club these categories 1 to 30 because here also 1 to 30 are working only for 10% workers. Then on the other hand, so now we can use this linker. This is a linker. On the other hand, 10% of workers worked 41 to 50 plus hours. So 41 to 50 plus hours is this category in Denmark compared to UK, where the proportion was around 15 to 20%. Now, instead of mentioning, okay, there was this was somewhere around 15, this was around 17, this was 20, we can simply go ahead and mention that this was uh, a category or a overall percentage value that is given to us. Now, this is how you can categorize. This is what I talked about when I talk about comparing the data and not just simply mentioning the data. This is how we summarize the data. Now, this is the point where you focus on summarization, right? So I hope this makes sense that how you summarize data, because instead of talking about each of the categories, this is you just summarize the data in categories where you see some sort of common reference point. And was one more thing to notice here that we mentioned. On the other hand, just a minute, yes. On the other hand, 10% of workers, and then we have higher. So this is the comparison, right? We also compare the data. We just simply don't quote it, but we compare the data also. So there's a linker, then we have compared the data between these two categories. Why am I focusing on these things? Because these are the things that you are marked upon. Anybody can write a report from, getting the data and then just write down the data. But what we are supposed to focus on are these important factors that the examiner is looking up for. Now, next, I compiles France and Sweden in the last body paragraph, because see, again, there's some sort of similarity here also that we can club together. So in France, 50% of workers work 31 to 35 hours per week. So this is a number of hours highest, followed by almost 37% of workers working 36 to 40 hours. So this is around 37. You can mention that. Since I mentioned almost, that means I'm not sure of the data, because a lot of times you will not be given the exact value. So make sure that you write approximate or almost next to it. On the contrary, again, another linker, the peak number of working hours Sweden was 36 to 40. Now here's a comparison I'm making, that in France it was 31 to 50, but on the contrary, in the Sweden it was this, with 60% of workers putting in these hours, followed by almost 40% of workers worked for 31 to 35 hours. So the major comparisons that I've made here is the highest and the highest of this category compared to the highest of this category, and what were the different ratios. So this is how you can summarize your data altogether. Next, let's move on to the overall. So give it a minute, go ahead and read this particular paragraph and see what inferences have we written about how we have summarized the data and how we have made comparisons here. All right. So let's have a quick recap of what we just covered right now. There's number one, you paraphrase your question by adding in the details. We have the countries here. We mentioned the percentage. Then instead of writing shows, we use the word illustrates as synonyms. How can you can change, right? You can mention depicts, shows, and there are different words, right? Then we start with overall paragraph, where you can start with on the whole or overall, or it is evident. You can start with it is evident, right? So these are the words that you can start to mention that, okay, the examiner would know this is the overall paragraph we are talking about. So the highest proportion, then we talked about the highest proportion of countries that given. Then we had body paragraph 1 and body paragraph 2, where we clubbed two similar countries with similar kind of patterns. And we mentioned, on the other hand, this is a linker. On the contrary, another linker. Then you have all right. So that is the overall mention. Now let's focus on the task assessment criteria. So there are four things that examiner looks for. Those four things are: number one, task achievement. So when I talk about task achievement, that means whatever the question was asking you to do, you have done that. Have you summarized the data? Is the data on point? The data is clearly relevant. You have compared the data. All of this is considered under task achievement, right? If you have done this properly, then you'll score a good band score in this particular category. Then we have coherence and cohesion. Coherence and cohesion is structure, how cohesively your data is or your report is flowing throughout. So you give it a structure, you give it an overall, you write the overall, you mention all the body paragraphs and the data in it. That is how your coherence and cohesion will be measured. Apart from this, these linkers that we talked about, for example, overall, then we talked about on the contrary, these linkers are also considered for your coherence and cohesion. Then we have lexical resource, that what kind of words have you used, right? The higher proportion, then highest proportion, or uh, if you can also talk about that the data surged in some instances, right? Or it the peak or was observed at this particular hours. So all these words can be used. So have a different set of words for how you mention the highest values, how you mention the lowest values, and how the data is compared. So what kind of words can you use? For example, whereas this proportion, instead of constantly mentioning percentage, you can mention that this particular amount or proportion. Then we have grammatical range and accuracy. So grammatical accuracy, of course, mentions that how accurately you have represented your data, that if your subject verb agreement is correct, but here if your tenses are correct, right? For example, the tenses is continuous throughout. If you have used past tense, like I used was here, then the overall report has been written in past only. This is how you ensure that your tenses are accurate. But in case, for example, let's say you're given a data where you have a chart where we are talking about, let's say, year from 2003 to 2025. So see, the years are changing here. So for example, when we're talking about 2003, you can use past tense, present tense when you're talking about 2023. And then if there are future predictions that tell, okay, in 2025, it will go up to this value, then you can use the future tense. This is how you maintain the tense accuracy in your reports. Apart from this, you can use different types of tenses. What are types of tenses? For example, your simple tense, we have continuous tense, we have perfect tense. So you can go ahead and use perfect tense in your reports. It shows a greater grasp over the language. All right. Let's move on. Next, we have, let's move on to the next slide. All right. Just a minute. Yes. So the last slide that we're going to cover is what are the tips that we have to keep in mind. So number one, you have to use linkers such as moreover. So we did not use what the other linkers apart from the on the contrary that we used. We have moreover, however, if we want to add any pointer, however, if you want to compare or provide a contrast, on the contrary, for a contrast, if we are comparing two situations, for example, there's a highest situation and then there's a lowest situation, then you can use however, on the contrary, whereas all of these linkers can be used, although when we're again creating a comparison between two things. What other linkers can you use? For example, we can use in addition, right? In addition to this, that is another way of writing this. So these are all the linkers that you can deploy in your writing task one. Take care of your spelling and punctuation. So punctuation is very important. Where you are putting your commas, your full stop, make sure that you are very well aware of your punctuation and the spellings that you are using. So if you see the chart and there are spellings given to you, make sure they are correctly quoting the data or the groups that are given to you. Take care of your grammar. Grammar, as I talked about the tenses, apart from this subject verb agreement, the kind of verbs that you're using, are they all in alignment? Cover all the requirements of the task. Do not leave any points. For example, summarize, highlight, give the structure to your task one, and compare the data. Do not just simply quote data. Make sure that you can draw as many comparisons or as possible. For example, the comparisons that we made with France. Sorry, what were the countries? Let's go back and see what countries did we make comparisons for. Yes, the countries like Denmark and UK. So make all these comparisons. If you can see some sort of pattern emerging, make sure that you give it that your report is showcasing that. So that is all for today. Thank you so much for joining. For more such interactive IELTS sessions and content, please follow us on LinkedIn and subscribe to our YouTube channel. If you want to enroll in any of the crash courses, IELTS comprehensive classes, or you require any of the IELTS resources, we have them available on our website. Please visit www.yunolearning.com. And if you have any other queries that you want us to address, please give us a call at this number. Thank you so much for joining, and stay hooked so that you keep seeing what other content we are bringing for you.